Welcome. I'm Doug Morgan, and you're listening to Uncommon Sense, where we hunt for the truth in the topics you're not supposed to talk about, Christianity and politics. We started off Monday with a piece about Sharia law, and it came from the Center for Renewing America, and it actually came out last December. But we got to the point on Monday where we started to talk about Islam's subversive influence in the government, and I want to pick up here and finish this off today for you. It starts off with a quote by Ayatollah Khomeini, and it says, "Islam is politics, or it is nothing." The rise of Zoran Madami, they say, the New York City's Muslim socialist mayor, is a perfect example of how the increase in the foreign-born Muslim population in the United States and Europe is extending the reach of Islam and Islamist sympathizers. The political left believes that Islam's anti-American ideological disposition mirrors its own political goals, viewing Muslims as a key ally in the critical theory infused attempt to tear down America's oppressive Christian patriarchy, right? Of course, Islam will dismantle the left once it's in power. Liberal voters in Hamtramck, Michigan, received a taste of this when the majority Muslim city council passed a law banning public display of the gay pride flag just a few short years after intersexual-minded progressives celebrated the election of America's first majority Muslim local government. For his part, Mamdani has promised a veritable buffet of neo-Marxist policies as mayor of New York City to win political support from radical progressives who see him as a vessel to achieve their goals. These policies include proposed rent freezes and raising the minimum wage to $30 an hour, and establishing government-run grocery stores, and creating an agency to send social workers to respond to 911 calls. Such proposals clearly demonstrate the political alliance between the far left, Islamists, and Islamist sympathizers. While their end goals may differ, there is unity among domestic Islamists and far-left progressives in advancing policies that aim to stall American renewal and degrade Western civilization. Recently, Madami made remarks suggesting Muslims were the real victims of 9/11 terrorist attacks when he said, quote, "My aunt stopped taking the subway after September 11th because she did not feel safe in her hijab," unquote. He claimed Madani's aunt, Musama Madami, lived in Tanzania during the time and did not wear a hijab. But, that just gets in the way of a good story, right? Mamdani also posted a picture of himself with Imam Sara Waha, whom he called one of the nation's foremost Muslim leaders. It is suspected that this foremost Muslim leader, as he called him, that he was a co-conspirator in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which killed 6 people, by the way. The attempt to reframe reality and gaslight Americans about the most horrific terrorist attacks in American history carried out by Islamic jihadists is not without purpose. The subversion is intended to soften the citizenry to submission to Islam. The playbook very closely resembles that of the communist movements throughout the 20th century. Much of Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, to rewrite or erase history and to untether people from their own civilization. I mean, this strategy lowers a society's defense to pave the way for revolution and deconstruction. Radical Islam and Sharia adherents have long used Western institutions to undermine Western principles and advance Islamic interests. There is perhaps no clearer illustration of this tactic than the recent revelations involving the coordinated and widespread welfare fraud scheme carried out by members of Minnesota's Somali Muslim community. The total cost of the fraud is allegedly in the billions of dollars. Reports state that a Somali enclave set up dozens of fake entities under the guise of culturally appropriate programming to bilk taxpayers through increasingly expensive government welfare programs. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or the USCIS, uncovered suspected fraud in 275 cases in Minnesota, St. Paul area alone. Some examples include the following. One alien admitted to fabricating a death certificate from Kenya for $100 to falsely claim the termination of a marriage. The spouse in question is alive and is living in Minneapolis and is the mother of 5 of his children. And here's another, an alien who is the son of a known and suspected terrorist overstayed his visa and found to have engaged in marriage fraud that resulted in the denial of several immigration benefit requests. Another one, an alien engaged in marriage fraud by taking advantage of an elderly U.S. citizen spouse, including subjecting the spouse to elder abuse and exploitation. In response to these and related cases, the USCIS Director Joseph Edlow pointed out that fraud is not a victimless crime, and said that fraud undermines the integrity of national security. But the scope of the foreign-born Somali community's fraudulent activities is far wider than simply fraud or theft. The numerous incidences Somali networks used these fraudulent entities to collect taxpayer money to defund remittance back to their home country through the Hawala system. It's a hard to monitor money trading system used in the Middle East and Southern Asia for centuries. But that directly went into al-Shabaab coffers to carry out Islamic terror operations abroad. One former official on the Minneapolis Joint Terrorism Task Force stated that, quote, for every dollar that is transferred from the Twin Cities back to Somalia, al-Shabaab is taking a cut of it. The use of the Hawala to move large sums of money through the archaic methods that leave neither a money trail nor a digital footprint has long been a powerful weapon in financing these type of terrorist actions. The 9/11 Commission found that Hawala, which is largely built on trust and transfers money via the Hawaladar operators from one location to another without concretely moving the funds, was critical in the financing of Al-Qaeda's operation across the globe. As elements of Sharia take root in Muslim enclaves of Minneapolis to Houston to Dearborn, the resources of hardworking American citizens will increasingly be used to fuel the ideology that, by its very nature, seeks to subjugate them. Meanwhile, progressive entities and officials in the United States have made common cause with these efforts and with the culturally significant ramifications already appearing. For example, the non-Muslim progressive mayor of Paterson, New Jersey, celebrated the first day of Ramadan earlier this year by declaring, Paterson is the capital of Palestine in the United States of America, unquote. Yeah, government officials must take into account the effect that this will have on the social fabric of Western nations. This shift has been going on for some time. Before Mamdani's mayoral election victory in New York City, Sadiq Khan became the first Muslim mayor of London in 2016. And in 2021, Boston and New York City elected their first Muslim city council members. And in 2022, Dearborn, Michigan inaugurated its first Muslim mayor. State legislators from Maine to Texas have welcomed about 50 Muslim members into their ranks over the past few years. And to be clear, not all Muslims are Islamists, but the fact remains that the growth of the foreign-born Muslim population is significantly expanding the reach of Islamists and their allies. The election of Islamists to both state and federal political office, especially the House of Representatives, is concerning not just because of the actions of these particular politicians, but also because of what it reveals about America's progressive induced identity crisis and destructive immigration policies and refusal to demand assimilation to our culture and a way of life. For example, a few years ago, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, of course, a Somali immigrant, described the 9/11 attacks as some people did something. This is a shockingly dismissive statement about an attack in which some people, radical Islamists, slaughtered nearly 3,000 Americans in a cold blood and sparked a 2 decades conflict overseas that saw even more American lives shattered or lost. Omar was also removed from the House Foreign Affairs Committee due to past anti-Semitic comments regarding Israel and concerns over her objectivity regarding the national security of the United States. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, born in Detroit to foreign-born Palestinian parents, was censored by the House of Representatives, with 22 Democrats joining Republicans after she repeatedly used the phrase, "from the river to the sea." This phrase is commonly considered to be a call to the end of Israel's existence and is the official slogan of the terrorist organization Hamas, which states outright that its chapter is and intentions are to murder millions of Israeli Jews. Observers can easily infer that the sentiments of Omar and Tlaib are deceptive narrative weaving of Mamdani and the criminal actions taken to fund jihad by vast swaths of the foreign-born Somali enclave in Minnesota, and are further evidence that for many Muslims with interests of Islam, concretely, supersedes the well-being of American citizens and fidelity to the United States Constitution. The common thread of their participation in the process and the institutions of the Republic appears to be the degradation of Western principles in favor of Islamic advancements. While it cannot be known where each Muslim's sympathies lie, the cultural shift represented by the large numbers of Muslims is self-evidently at odds with American cultural norms and the foundation tenets of Western civilization. The First Amendment is not a suicide pact, and it does not require American policymakers to intentionally ignore the threats of growing Muslim populations sympathetic to Islam, many of whom are foreign-born and make use of broken refugee and visa programs. While it is true that not all Muslims are Islamists, it is also true that all Islamists are Muslims. And the evidence suggests that the existence of large Muslim populations causes major concerns for a country wanting to evade the threat of Islamism. So, what about the broader Western world? Well, Imam Chadari said this. He said, "The flag of Sharia will eventually fly over Downing Street." The growing support of Sharia law is a concerning sign of Islamist influence in the West. Polling from a decade ago shows that a substantial number of American Muslims surveyed believe that Muslims should have the choice of being governed according to Sharia law as opposed to the United States Constitution. A poll released by the Center for Security Policy showed, quote, more than half, that's 51%, of U.S. Muslims polled believe that they should have the choice of American or Sharia courts, or they should have their own tribunals, to apply Sharia. Similarly, in 2013, Pew Research study on Afghan nationals reported that 99% of Afghans surveyed wanted Sharia law to be the official law of their land, and 61% of Afghans surveyed believe Sharia law, yes, believe Sharia law should be applied to all citizens, including non-Muslims. The large number of Muslims who want Sharia law indicates firm support and sympathy for Islamism, political and a political end, which is effectively the establishment of Islamic theocracy. It is essential to note that some of the specific provisions of Sharia law that would be applied to everyone under Islamic law include the following, okay? Honor killings and stoning to death as punishment for adultery. It would include death as punishment for leaving Islam and converting to another religion. It would include polygamy as an acceptable practice. And it would include corporal punishment, including stoning, lashing, and amputation of limbs for certain crimes such as theft, blasphemy, and adultery. In a constitutional republic founded on principles such as religious liberty and the rule of law built on Judeo-Christian framework, there is simply no place for Sharia law, which explicitly aims to replace all forms of government, political, economic, laws, human societal interactions with strict precepts derived straight from the Quran and Hadiths. Sharia law is not only incompatible with Western forms of government, but explicitly at war with them. In Europe, some of the predictably uglier aspects of Sharia law are emerging after predominantly Christian and cultural Western nations invited tens of millions of foreign-born Muslims into their nations, particularly through destructive refugee policies. For example, in 2023, the Italian court gave a Pakistani couple life sentence for killing their 18-year-old daughter because she refused an arranged marriage. In the United Kingdom, honor-based abuse offenses recorded by police forces have increased by more than 60% since 2022. In August, the Vienna Regional Court for Civil Matters in Austria confirmed an arbitration award based on Sharia law. A report released from the French government earlier this year summed up the disaster unfolding in Europe by stating that, quote, the Muslim Brotherhood poses a long-term threat to France's national cohesion, not through violence, but by gradually eroding secular values at the local level, unquote. Yet European governments continue to capitulate to Islamism. The Middle East Forum reports that for years, dozens of Sharia councils have existed in the United Kingdom and are mandating the resolution of civil dispute according to Sharia and not British common law. In fact, last year, April, an employment tribunal judge in the United Kingdom found a British citizen, Patrick Lee, guilty of misconduct over posts on X, including one calling the Prophet Muhammad a monster. Lee recently won legal protection from expressing his beliefs, but his case demonstrates how Islamists are effectively tightening their grip on legal institutions across the West. Such alarming Islamification has been spreading throughout the West for a long time. And in 2014, a German court ruled that Islamists who patrolled a city's streets as Sharia police, is what he called it, did not break the law and would not be prosecuted. Demographically, the number of Muslims in percentage of the total population in key Western nations is exploding. In England and Wales, the total percentage of population identified as Muslim is now at least 6.5%, in an increase of 33% from 2011. In France, the percentage of population identifying as Muslim is 10%. Yeah, in Germany, Muslims now comprise at least 6.4% of the population, with an estimated 5.5 million foreign-born Muslim immigrants living in the country. In Austria, Muslims comprise at least 8.3% of the population. It is imperative to point out that beyond the existential implications of Sharia law that it has for basic human liberty and Western civilization, significant aspects of Muslim culture are simply not compatible with Western values. For example, the consanguineous marriages in which spouses are related by blood are prevalent in many Arab nations, with rates ranging as high as 50% in some countries. In Britain, estimates from 2021 suggest that the majority of British Pakistanis are married to first cousins. These marriages are not prevalent in the United States, but in fact, 23 states banned the practice between 1858 and 1940. But recently, the Delaware legislature considered legislation introduced by State Representative Adana Wilson Anton, which would recognize marriages between first cousins. Wilson Anton assessed that the bill was designed for a constituent who wanted to bring his spouse from another country into the state. According to the Institution for Family Studies, bans on these type of marriages are necessary to health-related reasons. Malign recessive genes that are less likely to express themselves in children born to unrelated spouses are more likely to manifest in marriages between close relatives. And yet, this will not be the last bill of this kind that a state legislature will have to consider. This is just a snapshot of Islam's growing power in Western nations. However, the growing Islamist demographic and voting bloc supporting the rigid application of Sharia law is reaching critical mass in European nations. So let's look at jihadist radicalization and homegrown violence. The quote here is from Anwar al-Awqai on Nadal Hassan's terror attack on Fort Hood. He said that Nadal Hassan is a hero. He is a man of consequence who could not bear living the contradiction of being a Muslim and serving in an army that is fighting against his own people, unquote. In 2016, the FBI issued an anonymous, if not obvious warning. Immigrant Muslim communities in America are more susceptible to radicalization from Islamic terrorist organizations to homegrown violence than the rest of the population. Organizations such as the Council on American Islamic Relations encourage this influence. In fact, in most significant terrorism financing cases in the U.S., this particular organization, the CARE organization, was listed as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian Committee, and a government exhibits from the trial revealed that CARE founder and its founders participated in a meeting of Hamas supporters in Philadelphia. President Donald Trump recently signed an executive order directing Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent to begin designating certain chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood as foreign terrorist organizations and specifically designated global terrorists. And according to the House Committee on Homeland Security, cases of homeland violence extremism are the greatest and most imminent international terrorism threat to the United States homeland because they are inspired by these FTOs, but lack a direct connection to an FTO. So this allows homegrown extremists to mobilize without detection. The FBI defines homegrown violence extremists as, quote, individuals of any citizenship who have lived and or operated primarily in the United States or its territories who advocate, are engaged in, or are preparing to engage in ideologically motivated terrorist activities in furtherance of political or social objectives promoted by a foreign terrorist organization, but are acting independently of direction by an FTO. So between April 2021 and September of 2024, there were more than 50 jihadist cases in 29 U.S. states. And since the beginning of 2023, there have been 158 plots in Western Europe. The House Committee on Homeland Security outlined these examples, which include some of the following. November 9th, 2022, Mustafa Mausabab Alaomer, he was 24, of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was sentenced to over 17 years in prison for attempting to provide material support to Islamic State, or ISIS. And on September 16th of 2021, he pleaded guilty to attempting to provide material support to ISIS regarding his plan to attack a church in Pittsburgh. In February 9th of 2023, Kambiz Attar Kashani, 44, of the United States and Iran, was sentenced for conspiring to provide equipment and technology for the benefit of the Central Bank of Iran, a designated entity that materially supports known terrorist organizations. May 17th, 2023, Seyfulo Savaf, 34, Uzbekistan resident, was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences plus 260 years in prison for carrying out a terrorist attack on October 31st of 2017 in the name of ISIS, in which he used a truck to kill 8 victims and hurt others on a bike path in Lower Manhattan, New York. June 29th, 2023, Khan Serkan Damalaka, 23, of Houston, Texas, was sentenced to more than 13 years in prison for attempting to provide material support to ISIS. He sought to join ISIS overseas, and if not, then he could carry out an attack on non-Muslims in the United States. A, quote, dream, unquote, of his was to be a martyr. June 13th, 2024, there's another Muslim, 27, of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, was sentenced to 120 months in prison and 15 years of supervised release for providing material support for ISIS. June 25th, 2024, DHS has identified over 400 individuals who have crossed into the United States over the past 3 years as subjects of concern, as they were brought by an ISIS-affiliated human smuggling network. The whereabouts of more than 50 remain unknown. November 26, 2025, one National Guard member was killed and another was critical condition after a targeted shooting near the White House in Washington, D.C. by a foreign-born Muslim refugee. The suspect is an Afghan national who was one of the many unvetted individuals who entered the United States in 2021 under the Biden administration. You see, Islamist organizations are also fomenting anti-American, anti-Semitic, and anti-Christian encampments and protests as American colleges and universities in support of terrorist organizations. National Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, for example, claims to support over 350 Palestine solidarity organizations on college campuses across the continent. In a value statement on its website, SJP says that the struggle for a free Palestine is interconnected with the struggle for black liberation, for gender-based and sexual freedom, and for livable and sustainable planet. All pursuits for freedom, justice, and equity are materially intertwined and require us to struggle against state violence, colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism in all of its forms. After Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th of 2023, SJP organized a National Day of Resistance, as they called it, and circulated a resistance toolkit to frame the attacks as a justifiable part of Palestinian struggle. This narrative encouraged campus demonstrations and amplified anti-Israel sentiment, pushing the agenda consistent with Hamas's border Islamist goal. This type of influence is not confined to college campuses. While the Trump administration is working to end the conflict with the Gaza Strip, Islamist Palestinian organizations continue to cause problems in the streets of the United States and Europe. For example, nearly 500 people were arrested in central London in October of last year during protests in support of the group Palestine Action. 3 suspected members of Hamas were also recently arrested for allegedly planning attacks on Israel and Jewish institutions in Germany. Islamism is the primary driving force for Islamic terrorism and violence. So what do we need to do to curb Islamism and Sharia? Well, for policymakers, the immediate task is to assess the full scope of the Islamification of the United States. If evidence continues to warrant it, investigations into enclaves and foreign-born Muslims should be multiplied and prioritized, especially in the light of the discovery of Minneapolis Somali community's widespread fraud network. The mass deportations must accompany such efforts. Aligned with these efforts should also be congressional hearings and whole of government initiatives that determine whether Islam ultimately seeks to use the First Amendment to abolish our constitutional republic. If the answer to that question is yes, then public policy must begin to reassess the universal application of rights organized in the U.S. Constitution to non-citizens and movements that explicitly aim at eradicating those rights. Further, if Islam's ultimate goal is the abolition of the U.S. Constitution, then the very question of whether a Muslim can faithfully take the oath of citizenship must be publicly approached. For Muslims, one allegiance is either to the United States Constitution, rooted in biblical understandings of natural rights, or it is to Sharia, rooted in Quran teachings on the supremacy of Islamic law. It simply cannot be both. This question will spark a predictable uproar with accusations of bigotry from progressives who benefit politically from the domestic rise of Islamism. But the well-being of long-term survival of the American Republic must supersede such, such calls for Sharia. In the meantime, immediate policy actions that should be taken are as follows. The executive branch should freeze all immigration from hostile Muslim majority nations and territories, including especially Palestinian territories and Afghans, Somalians, Iran, Yemen, that type of thing. Congress should statutorily enact a strict vetting process for U.S. visa programs that include an intensive program flagging support for Sharia law and other culturally incompatible practices, child marriage, cousin marriages, all that kind of stuff. Both the executive branch and the legislative branch should permanently prohibit visas for individuals who hail from hostile Muslim majority nations and territories. State legislatures should consider preempting localities from and municipalities with noise ordinance bills that restrict the ability for the muezzins to use the mosques and other structures to broadcast the Islamic call for prayer over entire neighborhoods and blocks and cities. And lastly, a broadly based legal approach is needed to address the fundamental challenge of the First Amendment being used by Islamists as a vehicle for its eradication. So, in conclusion, Islam and Sharia law, they pose a persistent, multifaceted threat to Americans' constitutional order, and a growing Sharia kind of not supernatural, but a super masochist type of enclave, demanding a robust action from the federal government to ensure that Islamism does not supplant the Western values on which the American Republic was founded. The executive branch and Congress must consider every possible response to this threat and ensure that our republic endures for generations to come. I know we went just a little bit long today. I wanted to finish this up because I think it was that important. We need to take this threat seriously. And I would love to hear what you have to say on it. And of course, you can always do that at uncommonsensepodcast.com. Thank you very much for listening.
This podcast is a production of Morganite Communications.